All right, welcome back, everybody. This is Coach Reese and Coach Loretta here with mental performance coach Adam Popp on the podcast Coffee with Coaches with us today. I'm very excited. Loretta told me about Adam Popp after meeting him at the Raven race held by Coach Jacob Moss with OMR. And since then, I've been digging into his background and have been absolutely astounded by his history. So I just want to say, thank you to one of the most decorated guests that we've had on the podcast. If I can, I'd like to give a little bit of a background. And Adam, if there's anything that I get wrong, please correct me. But
No, I'm scared.
and this is only
You've been digging up all sorts of dirt.
What's that?
I said, you've been digging up all sorts of dirt on him.
Yeah.
He's even sharing things. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that.
Let's hear what we got.
Okay, so first and foremost, Adam, thank you for your service to the country. In 2007, an IED took his leg, and he suffered an amputation. 8 years later, ran his first 100-mile race. He's got all sorts of accolades, like becoming second para-elite at Boston Marathon, first ever amputee to finish the JFK 50. He set multiple records that we can probably get into as well, both in the para-amputee realm as well as just outright course records at different races. His credentials are fantastic. He's got 2 master's degrees, one of them in rehabilitation and clinical counseling, and the other one in performance psychology. And Adam, I was absolutely floored when I also saw that you had a special bourbon dedicated to you from Evan Williams Bourbon. So if anybody wants to go check that out, it is on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're both really excited to get into the topics. And, I guess we can start by just saying, 24-hour, the Raven, like, how did you and Loretta meet and what happened that day?
Yeah, I do want to correct one thing that you mentioned, and maybe we can get into this later too, but you mentioned first amputee to finish JFK, and I thought that for a long time. I became friends with the race director after that race, and when I met him at the finish line, he was like, I have to double check this, but I think you're the first amputee who finished. And he did some check-in, emailed me like a week later, and he was like, yeah, you're the first. And then years and years later, I found out a girl named Kelly Bruno actually finished that race maybe 2 years before I did. And that just points to record keeping and kind of the things that go around amputees running ultras. There's not a lot of good record keeping around that. And when I was new to the sport and trying to reach out and learn from others, there wasn't a lot of information out there. There was like 2 people I found who were doing this type of stuff. And obviously there were more. It's just not well reported or put out there. So just correct that, and also just give you accolades for, having this format to share these types of stories and put it out there a little bit more. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the clarification. I think that's outstanding when,
Yeah.
we can give credit to information that we find out later on. So even still, it's quite the accomplishment being an ultra runner. A lot of people who are, completely able-bodied, kind of scoff at the idea of running 100 miles or participating in ultra endurance events, saying things like, I would never drive 100 miles.
Right.
Like, I couldn't even run a 5K, like all this and that. And I think it just goes to show the mental fortitude that can really propel you through such wild endeavors, regardless of what you have going on.
Yeah, totally.
So back to the Raven.
Yeah.
So how did you guys meet and what happened that day?
Yeah, well,
I was gonna say he was stalking me all day.
That's
okay,
right.
Go ahead.
That's right. That's right. Well, early on in the race, I was just trying to get into my rhythm and figure out like a good pace that was working for me. And Loretta and I probably, I don't know, maybe an hour, 2 hours in, I don't know, kind of blurs together at this point, but we were on a very similar pace, and I didn't want to pass her because then I'd be going too fast, and it felt like weird running behind her. And this is my first 24-hour track event, so I didn't really know the protocol or the etiquette, which I dealt with a lot that day. But and then we just were on the same pace, so we were shoulder to shoulder, just chatting a little bit, and she was telling me a little bit about her story and asking me about mine. And then I put 2 and 2 together. I was like, oh, I think I've listened to a podcast with you before. And she was like, yeah, telling me about this. I listened to the one with Jacob Moss actually in preparation for the Raven, because I had a phone call with Jacob and Riley, who are the race directors. And anyway, was studying up on them as you seem to study up on your guest as well. And anyway, listen to that podcast, and then I was like putting two and two together. It's like, oh yeah, your voice is very, very familiar. I've never seen your face because I just listened on the phone, but so yeah, then we just started chatting, and she mentioned in a previous podcast how the miles were just ticking by and not really thinking about it, and pace was going great, and heart rate was lowered, and it was just really a joy to run with her and the other runners that day and learn a little bit about them. And it's really easy to do, or much easier, I should say, to do on a track event like that than, point to point ultras or longer stuff, trail stuff.
Yeah, definitely. It changed our several laps of just talking and kind of forgetting about what we were doing was super nice. And then one of my other fun parts was his little one, the 18 months old. What's their name?
Yeah, his name's Logan, and
Okay.
he was 16 months at the time, but
Okay. And he
yeah.
was so happy all day. So he was kind of entertaining for me to watch toddle across the middle of the track. So my
Yeah.
background is special education and early intervention. So I spent a lot of time with infants and toddlers. So it was fun for me to watch.
Yeah, they're super nice. They and again, that type of event, I've never had him out there like seeing me run that much. And he was just in the infield, and Riley brought over some toys for him and some balls, and he was just playing in the infield, and he and my wife were just having a great time, just
Yep.
like another Saturday at the park. And
Right.
meanwhile, I was out there just
That's great.
And how did the day end up for you? How did that 24 hours go?
Yeah, I think the overall expectation heading into the race, I kind of like probably went above what I was expecting for the 100-mile section of it, and then a little bit under for the 24-hour, what I was hoping for. But again, this was my first time, first experience at this type of format, and I really didn't know what to expect. And we can get into that maybe later too. But having run 24 hours and 100 before is different than running for 24 hours when you can get in your car and leave or whatever that was. So I ran, my 50, 100K, 100-mile, like faster than I've ever ran all those intermediary splits. And then I didn't really set myself up for success in the end because, like I said, my wife and kid were there, and we were flying out actually the next evening. And I was like, I just want to go home and sleep. So I didn't prepare on that side of it. And I think I learned a lot through that. And in future events, just giving myself a lot of time on the back end to really just rest, lay in the hotel bed, and not do anything for a day or two, and really put myself out there for the full 24 hours, and instead of just running hard for 100.
And what were those things that you learned about the 24-hour distance as opposed to just running and ending with a 24-hour time?
Yeah, I think mainly from kind of what I mentioned, but mainly from the mental standpoint, I thought I was very well prepared in that aspect going into it. And then what I learned was, and somebody mentioned it before we even started, like your car is right there every lap, and you get to think about that every lap. And it's something I thought about, but I didn't put a lot of time and effort into how to overcome those like full feelings of, okay, you can just go there. So like I said, being prepared in that aspect, but also giving myself a little bit of recovery and ability to just like decompress for a day or two after the race instead of getting on a plane immediately that afternoon. And that was a bit of a driving factor, but also like I had a little bit of back pain. I think looking back, I probably could have gone through that or ran through that a little bit better. But I think the bigger aspect was being the first, again, time in that format and not putting those things in place ahead of time. It was just really eye-opening to me. And we learned through these experiences, and I think I've gotten a lot better at like the 100 distance and 50 and marathon through running a lot of them. And I learned a lot in this like 17 hours that I ran. So looking forward to future events where I can really put that into practice.
24
Yeah,
hours, a whole different beast.
Yeah.
And I do just want to mention for the listeners too, it's not like this was your first time at like a flat, fast course.
Mhm.
You've done Tunnel Hill, I think multiple times. JFK has sections where it's just, like a flat paved trail.
Mhm.
Let's see, you've done the Marine Corps Marathon 50K. So, I mean, you have like a repertoire of many, many fast and flat races. So it sounds like just that like idea of, oh, like I can't like, I feel like there's a certain mental crutch when we have to say like, oh, well, I have to go 7 miles to get to an aid station if I want to drop. And then you get to that aid station and you think you get out of that aid station feeling good. You hit another low patch. You think, oh, well, I have to go another 7 miles to the next aid station before I can drop. Whereas in a race like the 24 hours where you're just going through like loop after loop after loop, that like that escape button is just so easy to push because there's never more than like, 100 meters that you have to walk back to the car,
Yeah, and I brought some crew there. One of my old training partners from the Washington D.C. area brought him there and like gave him a game plan, and he was like trying everything he could do to like talk me into running more. And I was like, I just want to go sleep. Which, to your point, if you're on a trail, you're not really. It's much easier to fight through that in those instances.
Yeah. So I did post a picture of Adam at Tunnel Hill, and I hadn't thought about it until he shared his pictures with me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I was there the year you ran it. I was
Yeah.
another runner, and I remember him running, and I remember cheering for him at different aid stops, but I never put it together until I saw that picture.
Yeah, Loretta. So who's stalking who now?
Exactly. We've got a problem.
Okay, so we had a coaches meeting a couple nights ago, and Jacob actually alluded to the fact that there were some records that you set at the 24-hour Raven that he held. Can you just brag about yourself for a little bit and let us know what those are?
Well, to my earlier point on not being a lot of great record keeping around, especially like specific to amputee ultra running. When we look at shorter distances, say from the marathon down, there's Paralympics that allow persons or athletes with disabilities to compete at these events, and there's great national and international record keeping around that. And there's a whole process where an athlete gets classified, and that's dependent on their disability. And it's a whole records review of your previous doctor's appointments and sitting down with a classifier who is also has a doctor in the room, and they come up with all these numbers. And then at the end of the day, you get a number associated with your disability, and that's who you compete against. So when I compete in paratriathlon, I'm competing against other people with similar disabilities. So most of them are above knee amputees, but others have other varying limitations that kind of equate to what my disability is, even though they might not be an amputee. So I'll just kind of give you the quick synopsis on that, and saying that when it comes to record keeping, like I said, up to the marathon, because of these high-level world-class events such as the Paralympics and World Championships, there's a lot of great record keeping around that. But once you get 50K and above, that's non-existent. And when I finished my first 100, which was Brazos Bend in 2016, I was kind of like trying to figure this whole process out. And basically, people were like, no, that's not us. I reached out to USA Track and Field. No, that's not us. And they just kind of pushed me around. We don't do that. I tried through Guinness World Records at the time, and they're like, no, that's your own national governing body. And I'd already been there, so I kind of just gave up on it at that point. And then flash forward, I think it was 2019 or 2020, I saw another amputee runner who had set multiple records previously. Her name's Amy Winters. She actually made the USA 24-hour team in I want to say 2016. Won races outright as a below knee amputee. Made the able-bodied national team for 24 hours, like I said. And she somehow got connected with Guinness again, and Guinness created this whole entire new category of persons with disabilities and tracking their records. And this was really, to my knowledge anyway, the first entity that I had learned about doing this. So I was like, okay, well, I'll go through that process, and filled out a bunch of applications for the previous races I did, and most of them were accepted. But again, I'm not 100% sure on, previous accomplishments from other people. I'm pretty sure now, but anyway, so I think this record keeping process has started at this point, at least. So anyway, long-winded, and at the Raven, I didn't, again, this is my first time at this format, first time having like USA track and field officials there and not really understanding kind of the ins and outs on how specific, having them like 3 stopwatches and measuring out the track and to like the specific 100-mile distance and 50-mile distances. I just went into the day like, all right, I want to try to do 100 miles, get a time for that. And then the 24 hours is kind of obvious. Get a distance for that. And as I started running or got closer to, 8, 10 hours into the race, Tony Bruno, who was there, who set an age group 50-mile record. And they were like getting us marks and doing all this stuff. And I was like, oh, I didn't know this was a thing. I didn't realize this is like how it has to be done. So I talked to my crew and I was like, let's just do every distance and get the marks for every distance just in case this ever becomes a thing. So it's official. And so we went and talked with the USA track and field officials, and they measured out the 50-mile and did that, and the 100K and the 100-mile, and then in the 24 hours. And all those were better than my times that had been, what am I trying to say? All those times that I set during that day were better than the times that were previously recognized as world records. So to my knowledge, they'll be approved eventually, but through Guinness. And the cool thing about that is when I got back, I reached out again to USA Track and Field, since these are like more official times and it has the whole like 3-page like record keeping, and reached out to the head of the MUT, and she was like, well, talk to the USOPC, and which is what I heard before too. And I was like, all right. So I reached out to them, and they're like, this isn't we do marathon and below. Like, you need to find somebody else that'll keep records on this. So I reached back out to Nancy, and she's like, let me talk to the council about it. And the cool thing about it is Amy, the same girl I mentioned earlier, Amy Winters, went to the 50K USATF National Championship in March, I think it was, and connected with a different official there. And she saw her out there running, and they talked. Meanwhile, I was like in Nancy's ear. And so I received an email like a week or two ago that USATF is like finally pursuing this now to do a little bit better national record keeping, which
Nice.
came from the Raven, which came from Amy, which came from athletes like her and I, like putting ourselves out there and really trying to push the limits, and also, bringing this out to a bigger audience. So.
Right. Nice job on advocating for that, for sure. So what were your times for the 50, the 100K and the 100?
Uh,
You know?
50, I think 50, I don't know off the top of my head. 50 was just over 8 hour, 8:03, I think. 100K was 9:57 maybe. And then the 100 was 16:13.
Nice.
Wow.
And again, I'd planned on running the full 24 hours. And when I was sending those intermediary like splits, especially at the 100-mile, I was just like running way too hard. I was like, I'm going to really like go for this. So the last like mile was maybe 2 miles was like way too fast for, but I got caught up in trying to like really set the best time I could at the end anyway, even though I paced so well early. And it was
Right.
like all out the window in like 10 minutes.
So my goal was around that pace, but I ended up having, well, I went in with an injury and I ended up having to drop because I couldn't step on my foot late in the race. But
Yeah,
you were on target. I could have
frustrating.
been there with you.
Yeah, it's frustrating. You never know what happens on race day, but you put yourself out there and try to hope for the best and see
For
what
sure.
happens.
For sure.
Adam, thank you so much for indulging us in some of your background. I think
Yeah.
it's super important for listeners to hear that, like, not only do you have the bookwork to back up what we're about to talk about, but you have the personal experience, and not only to be running these races, but then be your own advocate and try to get these systems in place to recognize the people that are doing amazing things that are differently able than a typical runner. I think is just another side of mental performance, with which you probably put a lot of your skills towards, just to get through that and get that hammered out, just for recognition in people doing amazing things.
Yeah, I
So I guess
appreciate that. It's been a long process to get there. It seems like it happened overnight, but this has been
yeah.
going on since basically 2015 at this point, and Amy had been doing this years before I had. So I think we're in a good spot now, though, moving forward.
So with that, let's talk about your business and the practice of mental performance coaching. Can you detail for us, like, what exactly is mental performance coaching?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask 10 people, I think you're going to get 10 different answers, but my opinion on this is really kind of twofold, and it's really understanding where mentally and emotionally where an athlete or yourself performs at their best, and then having the ability to get there when it matters most. So if you think about, that's kind of a two-part process, right? It's having that awareness level, and I know you talked to Coach Katie about this a couple weeks ago, and I listened to that one. And you guys talked a lot about this awareness level, but it's first building this awareness level on where you need to be when it matters most, whether that's on race morning or game day, or even if it's within practices or, 80 miles into an ultra, 100 miles into 24-hour, whatever that might look like. Um, so having that awareness on mentally and emotionally where you need to be, and then putting the skills in place to be able to get yourself there. Um, and again, you guys talked a lot about those mental skills, but that's breathing and visualization and imagery and mindfulness and all those types of things that are able to, either lower our arousal level or stress levels, or raise them up when we need to, or kind of push through those intrusive thoughts that might come in at times.
And why would this be beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, or there's some numbers out there, but we're having like tens of thousands of thoughts a day. Um, and for the most part, a lot of those lean towards unproductive, is what I'll call them, unproductive, or maybe you might call them negative or bad thoughts. Um, and if we're having that many thoughts a day and we're kind of leaning towards the less helpful or more unhelpful perspective, then these types of training and awareness can lead us into really building an awareness around those thoughts, but then how to shape our thoughts. And as you might know, like, our thoughts lead to actions, lead to feelings, lead to emotions, lead to actions. So it kind of starts and ends with those thoughts that are going into our through our brain. So really working with those thoughts and understanding the best ways that each individual can work either with or through those thoughts, I think plays huge dividends, whether it's, running or sports or daily life for that matter.
So you talked about the two things: awareness of where you need to be come race day for your best performance, and then skills to get you there. I guess for number one, the awareness of where you need to be. Can you give us some personal examples? Where do you personally need to be before a race?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's a lot of prep work leading into the race, right? It's visualization on how, I talked about it earlier, like how I'm starting the race, what kind of the conditions might be like, what the people around me, and it's really finding that rhythm, like I mentioned earlier. And I think when I'm able to really set myself up leading into the race, like, all the anxieties kind of lessen anyway. I wouldn't say they're completely gone, but you just feel at ease when you're starting, right? So it's a lot of what I might call confidence through competence. So it's doing all uh, the training block and the mental prep and all these things around it, like anything you can control and with it is within your power. Um, really, like, do that to the best of your ability. And the better you can do that, the better you're going to end up on the start line, right? So it's not necessarily all going to go your way, or some of those trainings might fall by the wayside. But for the most part, I think if you can do that, it's going to help and pay dividends early on. And then again, it's like working through, it's trying to stay in a productive mindset as long as possible. And then again, like, there's skills and types of visualizations that I do that when something comes up, like, how am I going to address this? So, um, and that's, like, again, all done from the comfort of, a chair in my room or the bed at night or whatever that might look like.
I love that. One of my sports psychology professors in college at UWM, she gave us this phrase, and I've heard it multiple times since. I don't think she's the creator of the phrase. It's pretty common, but it is control the controllables. And I think that's, as a coach, that's what we always try to impart onto our athletes. We can control how you train. We can control where you train, what you train on, your elevation. We can control what you're practicing and fueling. We can control too, like you said, visualizing and thinking about the race and thinking about like your emotions kind of build, such as a lot of people get pre-race anxieties, you know, imagining that from the comfort of our living room and then taking deep breaths and practicing that calming piece. Those are all things that we can control, we can do, we can practice at any point in the day. And I think that's what I love about like mental performance is that you don't have to be running to practice
Right.
it.
Right.
So I love that idea because ultras are filled with so many uncontrollables that anything that you can grab hold on and at least say like I've got this is just a huge mental boost.
Yeah, totally.
So along that line, when you're visualizing, like, so you mentioned you go through different scenarios, you go through things that may pop up, things that you may experience. What else do you think about when preparing for a race? Do you think about like my stomach going south? Do you think about like conquering all your goals? Like, give us some practical takeaways of what people should be thinking about before their race.
Yeah, I mean, well, maybe I can, instead of me specifically, just talk about visualization or imagery at like a higher level and the different things it can be used for. And I was curious about your experience and background too, Reese, because when I listened, like I said, to the podcast previously with Coach Katie, you seem very well versed in this. So I didn't know if you worked with a sports psychologist but it seems like you have some educational background behind it as well.
Yeah, just it's mainly from bachelor's of science in kinesiology and
Hmm.
learning through sports psychology, and also just wanting to be a student of the sport and listening to
Totally.
other coaches, reading papers myself, and a lot of this too. I feel like at some part or at some point, like we all we all have this idea of this is what, like, we've all thought about the races that we're going to be racing that are coming up, right? But I don't think that a lot of us take that to that practice level to say that like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about the race, I'm thinking about what the weather is going to be like, but now let's take that extra degree and say like, what if the weather's not good? What if it's really
Yeah.
slick? What if it rains? Like, I always, in my head, I have the bias of thinking that every day is going to be 60 degrees and sunny and the footing is going to be great, and that's not always the case. So I think instead of, like, this is stuff that a lot of us do to a surface level, but then kind of like digging a little bit deeper and practicing these skills is pretty important. And that's what I try to strive for in my ultra running and my coaching and whatnot, is just, hey, if we can get you prepared for any scenario, then what do you have to be anxious about?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And that's my point exactly. And I have a good example of this that happened recently is I went down to Brazos Bend and the race was supposed to be early December and they had some floods. So they had to close the park and then they pushed it to January 6th. So they pushed it back a month. And then, so everybody's like freaking out, like change a date, training, this and that. Which is understandable. And, if you're as prepared as possible, you can kind of brush it off and move on. And, oh, this is an extra, it's kind of how we shape our perspective again, right? So it's like, oh, an extra month of training or whatever that might look like for the individual. So they pushed it to January 6th, more raining, more floods, and they had to move venues from Brazos Bend, which again I ran in 2016, very flat, like ideal course for me as an amputee because not a lot of technical sections, flat. It's still trail, but not something like the AT on JFK. So then floods again at the park. They have to move venues and they had to move it to this ranch where they hold Habanero 100, which is like, it's sandy. They hold it there for um, the difficulty of it, right? It's in July in Texas, in the sand, and they have some type of stat on their website about how few finishers have finished that race because of the conditions there. So they moved to the 7IL where it's sandy and it's in January, so not as hot, but and then everybody on their Facebook page on the comments is just like, you know, so frustrated by that and how difficult the day is going to be and while that might be true, if you're like out there voicing it and it's already stuck in your head before you get into the start line and you're kind of having those intrusive thoughts about how bad my day is going to be and you're not even on the course yet, like you've already lost, in my opinion. So, um, so trying to, again, like to your point, visualize or be ready or be prepared for any condition. And it's not always going to be that sunny day, but when we're prepared as possible and as ready as possible, and the competitor next to us is worried about the sand or it raining or it not being sunny or whatever that might be, we already have a leg up there. So it's a good point that I just wanted to piggyback on.
I think that we talk about
thank
a lot.
you.
And I think we talk a lot about here on this podcast about being adaptable to in those events, right? So being able to have the tools in your toolbox that when you get into that situation that was not what you expected, you can take care of that rather than fall apart or DNF or whatever may happen.
Yeah, totally. I like to look at it, and one of the sessions I do with a local team here is like challenge versus threat. So are you viewing this as like a threatening experience where, the sand and everything is going to like slow me down and do all these things? Or are you looking at this as a challenge as, well, it's going to slow everybody else around me down, but if I can overcome this better than they can, I'm going to like fare better than maybe even if it was at Brazos-Spin, the original like venue. And that's partially how I looked at going into the Raven as well, in the sense that it's an invitational event with all these like super high level athletes that had to run really like amazing times to get there. And if you look at my like ultra sign up and the ranking they give you, I was like the bottom or second to last one on there, right? And it's partially because some of the races I ran are super technical, like I said, and it like slows me down a lot in those areas. Again, because I'm an amputee, but anyway, long story short, my like number is not great on there, and I'm running against all these like other amazing athletes. And am I going to view that as a threat, or am I going to view that as this is an opportunity for me to run with amazing people, be prepared as possible when I show up on race day, mainly from a physical standpoint, but an all aspect standpoint, um, and really go out there and like show them like that I belong there and that I can run well and represent my community well and the running community well. So that's how I kind of viewed going into the Raven, as just like this huge challenge for me to really show up and perform well. And I think it worked well for me in that instant.
That is beautiful, because I think that like mental thought shaping, that mental reframing, it takes these feelings of anxiety, which the difference between anxiety and excitement physiologically are next to nothing. The same neurotransmitters are released, the same hormones are released, the fight or flight response is activated, but it's that mental shift of like, oh, I'm not viewing this as, oh shoot, this is going to be tough. I'm fearing this, as opposed to like, okay, this is going to be tough. Like, I got this. I can use these butterflies to work against me instead of like crush me down. So I think that's great, because it really wraps back into that whole like skills of how you get to where you need to be, is like, think about these challenges as things that we put ourselves through, So instead of, I love that. Instead of things weighing you down and being a threat, it's more of like lifting you up and giving you that excitement and that energy in a positive way, instead of just taking up mental space and wasting mental energy in situations that we can't control.
Right. And that's, as you know, very limited resource, those focus mental resources and attention and all that.
So when you have athletes and when you have the team, like, what's the process of coaching people through these skills? Like, what does it look like when you sit somebody down and you begin working with them?
Yeah, good question. You know, again, if you ask 10 different people, like it's similar to any other person or athlete you work with, right? So whether it's from a coaching standpoint or like an equipment standpoint, nutrition standpoint, like each athlete's going to be very different in what works well for them, how they kind of receive information. And basically it's sitting down with the individual to really understand them. But I can paint it as like maybe a bigger framework and how I start the conversation and again try to raise that awareness level and get athletes thinking about times that were a great performance and or maybe a not so great performance, and what they learned through that, and from specifically the awareness standpoint. And when you start to do this, like they're like, I don't know, it's just like clicking that day. And that awareness level is pretty low in a lot of cases. Um, but the way I like to do it is just having a conversation. And, if you think about like the y-axis, and I lump what's important to the athlete on kind of the right side of the y-axis. And then I lump um, what thoughts are kind of getting in the way from what's important to them or how they're performing, right? So again, as we talked about, like thoughts kind of lead to emotion and actions. So what are these like challenging thoughts, feelings, emotions that are leading them away from what's important? And whether that's training or family, whatever that might look like, it's kind of spelling that out for the individual. So if we have the thoughts that are kind of leading us away, like what actions then are kind of falling down from those thoughts or preceding those thoughts? And so if like the action that say that like the thought is, I'm going to get blown out at the Raven by this competition. And what is the action? What is the resulting action from that? Well, why even train? And all the while that's like leading us farther away from who we want to be, what's important to us, where we want to be on race day. And that's like a really easy example, but it's really spelling out all these thoughts that are going through our mind, and then the resulting actions that are kind of leading us away from who we want to be. And then lastly, like to your point, is understanding what skills can either address the thoughts, address the actions, and help us lead us towards who we want to be, what's important to us, where we want to be on race day or in our personal life for that matter. And those skills, again, I think you talked about them a lot, but something simple as like breathing or imagery or meditation, or if a lot of the thoughts are kind of coming up at night, putting skills in place and keeping us awake, as sleep's like most important for what we do. A skill that we can put in place is things that address sleep and thoughts that come up at night, and restlessness, sleeplessness, and things like that. So a lot of mental skills, but also like physical planning and preparation as well.
That sleep example hits close to home, that's for sure. So just
For
to
most people, I
draw,
mean.
yeah, just to draw like an analogous line between mental performance coaching and then like we're the physical side, we're the physical physiology coaches, right? Like what we do is we ask athletes questions like, where do you want to go? What races are coming up? We dig into their background and say, okay, where is your fitness right now? Where has your fitness been? What has the past 4 or 8 weeks of your training actually looked like? So that way we can kind of get this like idea or this template of like, hey, like where is this athlete at in their career? And it sounds like you do the exact same thing, except with mental goals. Instead of physical goals or races, it's, hey, where is your mental state at right now? Where do we want it to be in the future to aid in our further goals? And then what kind of tools and what kind of like mental workouts do we need to do to help get us there? So I think that's just a beautiful line of, taking the mental side of coaching and drawing some very very close tangents to it with what we do in the physical world.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I see it as, my job being a small piece of the puzzle for an athlete to be at their best, right? So you have like the physical coaching, you might have like clinical counseling, which I have a background in, but which is not what I do with athletes, right? But you can imagine if people are having clinical depression or anxiety, working with a counselor or psychologist who can address that's probably going to aid in performance as well. Same way I would work with an athlete in mental performance to aid, and then the physical, like coaching, as you mentioned, would aid. And it's kind of like this puzzle. If you want to be the best you can be, grabbing all these experts and getting them on your team or your board of directors or whatever you want to call it, and working with each individual who are experts in their field, putting that puzzle together. Then again, you're going to be the best athlete as possible, or the best athlete you can be.
And I
Yeah, and
love
I
that.
think the
That's our approach, to coaching with Ornery Mule coaching is that holistic approach, right? And having that team collaboration with a
Mhm.
running coach and dietitians and a physical therapist. And then next piece is that mental performance. So just having that global look, that's how we are going to get better, because no one's is a specialist in everything. So,
Right. So,
putting that team together.
yeah, I love that. And I heard from one of the previous podcasts too, how you have like a doctor who I guess does like an exam initially to kind of understand like biomechanics and
Yes,
limitations and stuff like that. And yeah, it's all like again pieces of puzzle that are going to make us better.
for sure.
I just had a mind. I just had a thought leave my mind. Um, okay, so one concept that I really like to think about in sports psychology is the cue utilization theory, and we kind of like touched on this a little bit. And that's the idea of like we don't want to be so aroused that
Hmm.
the higher our arousal, the narrower our field of vision gets, the narrower our focus gets. We get very hyper focused on just one thing. But yet, if we are not aroused whatsoever, then we're not actually like mentally in the game. We're not mentally invested to be able to pay attention to the things that we need to pay attention to. So there's this fine line between like we want to be aroused enough mentally to be able to focus in and zone in and be in the flow with the things that we need to, but not so aroused that the anxiety is really high. And I think that's something that, as a competitor myself, I've been trying to dial in at multiple starting lines. And I guess just thinking about it off the top of my head, like I think to myself, where in my career have I had the best performances, and what was I thinking
Yeah.
during or before the races? And I think that comes down to that awareness, right, of like where you need to be. And thinking to myself, I had a great race last weekend. Things went really well. Ended up setting a record and didn't even know about it. And I thought to myself, like, what was different about this race than
Right.
about previous races, right? And
Yeah.
what was different about this race was that like it was a pop-up that we were invited to like a week or so beforehand. There was no pressure on it. I didn't do any like research into the course. I knew that it was going to mimic Potawatomi, which we have coming up in a week. But I went in on the starting line just thinking to myself, like, I don't care what my watch says for time. I don't care what it says for heart rate. I just know that I want to find that red line and I want to hold it for as long as I can. And it's a 13-mile race. I have some half marathon um, uh, experience. So the entire race, I was just thinking to myself, like, not what is my time? What is my pace? Where am I in the field? I was thinking, am I following that red line? Do I feel like I'm
Hmm.
actually giving it my all? So when I think about like, some of my better performances, like for me, I know that I need to be really chill. I need to be
Yeah.
really calm. I need to be like mentally relaxed at the starting line, not thinking like, oh, I have to hit this pace from the get go or
Right.
whatever. And just me trying to be self aware, I think to myself, well, if I can save all of that mental energy of worrying, of stressing, of like all of this, I just have more energy to then give when I actually need to give it during the
Totally.
race, whether
Yeah.
it's
Totally.
covering moves or whether it's, pushing extra hard into the finish line. And that's the thing that I love about ultras is that, like, if you're running a 50-mile race, if you're running a 100-mile race, like chances are at the beginning you should be going like fairly controllable. So the beginning, it's not like a 5K where it's like gun goes off and instantly you have to be like up at that line.
Right.
In ultras, in a 50 and 100 miler and a 50K, like you can kind of just build into the effort a little bit. And I always tell my athletes too, like try to remain calm at the starting line because we all love to push really hard at the end of the race and not get past. Because I think that builds further positive momentum when we can be the ones doing passing in the second half of a race as opposed to, just hanging on in the second half.
Right.
And I think a lot of that just comes down to not burning all of your mental matches before the race even starts.
Yeah. Totally.
Coach Loretta, do you have any examples of you going through the two rules that Adam gave for us before? Being aware and then using skills to get you through, to mentally get you through races?
Sure, sure. I mean, I also do a lot of visualization. That's a big thing for me. And trying to think about, in my visualization, if something doesn't go the way planned, what am I going to do and how am I going to come out of that? I think. And then I also like to try to break down the race. At the Raven, so I have this issue where I do really well. And then I start hitting milestones like the marathon, then the 50K. Then I'm like, oh, I'm almost to the 50 mile. Well, you're really not almost to the 50 mile, right? You still have a lot of miles between the 50K and 50 mile. And that will mess with my head because I'll get ahead of myself. So there I had to kind of bring myself back and say, just, okay, let's just get to the next mile, instead of like get to 50K or 50 mile, then 100K. And so those are some tools that I am like really try to work on, is trying to break it down and stay right where I am in the moment. Because the minute I get ahead of myself is when I start to struggle mentally and, kind of like going down the not where I want to be.
I think a lot of what we've been talking about too is kind of like outside of race mental performance prep. How do we visualize the race? How do we get to the starting line? How do we calm our nerves? How do we get sleep before a race? Do you have any skills or any tools that you give to athletes for like during races? What should we be thinking about for mental performance during a race?
For me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, for ultra specifically, or for, I guess, longer endurance races, like one of the tools that works well for me, and I think maybe other athletes as well, is trying to figure out, um, well, understanding that it's gonna hurt, and when it hurts, and when it starts to like suck and not be going the way you want it to be going, like, why are you out there? You talked about that before with Coach Katie. And then also like having some type of keyword or mantra, or, to Loretta's point of um, looking too far ahead or not necessarily being present, but having some type of like keyword or mantra to like bring us back into the present moment, and or that really gets to the core of why we're out there. Um, and for me, for a long time, uh, I can share this like specific example, but in 2016, I was trying to make the national championship for triathlon, and I went to this race and I missed the cutoff. Like, it's a hard time cutoff by literally 2 seconds over an hour and 40-minute race. Um, and you start like reflecting on that, like how many option or opportunities did I have to like make up 2 seconds during this race, and it like really gets at you, right? And long story short, that snowballed me into, okay, I didn't make the national championship. So then that was like when I started training for my first 100. But from that point forward, I just like started telling myself like every second counts. And that became my mantra for those like really tough times when I want to walk right now. This is not going the way I wanted to. I got pain or whatever else. And then you kind of have that mantra in your back pocket, like, well, every second counts. You remember that one time when literally 2 seconds mattered. And that helps you again get to that present moment and start pushing forward. That's one I like personally, probably because it worked well for me and works well for me to this day. Um, but I think just understanding again, like why you're out there and trying to like summarize that into like a couple words, or like some type of visualization in the instant can help push through those times.
Beautiful. And we're running a little bit low on time here. I know Coach Loretta has to be out of here in 10 minutes, but can we tell the listeners like where can they go to get in contact with you? Do you have a website? Where can we reach you at?
Yeah, I mean, just my name.com, Adam Popp.com. I have a website there, and then it's linked. My business is like linked through there, but yeah, I would love to connect either through there or social media, whatever that might look like.
And you mentioned to us before too that you have a business called Couch to 100, and
Yeah.
it's got an interesting story behind it. Could you share that with us now? I've been waiting all
Oh
podcasts
yeah,
for it.
yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a play on like the Couch to 5K program, and I was injured in 2007, lost my leg in December 2007, and basically from 2007 to April 2015, I was like a huge couch potato. I did zero physical activity, and I had a great excuse for it, right? Like I hated running before I lost my leg, so like now that I don't have a leg, like it's a pretty good excuse not to run. But anyway, through a series of events in early 2015, I was this like 7.5 year couch potato, and then went to Walter Reed where I received care and got a running prosthetic, and just started out really slow trying to get um, enough running ability to finish this relay race in Washington State. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. And I ran a half marathon later, like in September. So starting in April, September, ran a half marathon. And that was like I'd ran one half marathon prior to this when I had two legs. And it was before that deployment that I lost my leg on. And now as an amputee, I ran like faster for that half marathon than I did before with two legs. And then I ran a marathon like a few months after that, Richmond Marathon, which I'd never run a marathon before. And then 19 months later, it snowballed into finishing that 100-mile race in Texas. So literally in the span of 19 months, I went from a 7.5-year couch potato to running 100 miles. So
Amazing.
yeah, that's how that came about. But also, it's kind of, that 100, in my opinion, it is always like an individual searching for their best ability or their maximum potential, if you will. And athletes who are at their peak are always like searching for that. And for me specifically, like I'm never necessarily reaching that. I think I am a lot of times, or think I'm getting close to it. But the more we're striving for that maximum potential or that 100, the better we're becoming, and the better athlete and person we're becoming. And so I think for my company's name specifically, like whether you're on the couch like I was in April 2015 or closer to that maximum potential on the 100 side or anywhere in between, like we can always strive to be a little bit better, and hopefully maybe achieve that 100. But regardless if we do or not, we're going to be really good.
Nice. So I wonder, Adam, do you have any success stories you could share about an athlete that has worked with you through mental performance and how it changed their running or their life?
I could do running. I could also, I'll do running, but I also want to do uh, a sports team I worked with 2 years ago, a collegiate sports team. And a colleague of mine and I like were pulled in halfway through the season because uh, they they weren't achieving as much as they had in the past or expected to, right? And we worked with them for the last like 6 or 8 weeks of probably 8 weeks of their season, which culminated in like their conference championship. And we did this really cool session that I really like, where it's basically like sharing what you see in the other people around you or the other people on your team and the attributes that they bring to the field. And we did that, and it was like an amazing experience for I think everyone in the field, and they got to like share a lot because they're guys and they're athletes, and they don't necessarily like share that with their teammates often. And anyway, like 3 days later, they go to their conference championship and win in like overtime, and beat this team they hadn't beaten all season. And it was just like a cool culmination of growing with these guys through 8 weeks and then having this like really powerful session and then seeing the results of that. And I'm not saying that like what we did with them in that room on that one day or those 8 days, like was that like obviously those athletes had it in them all along. And I think that's another one of my perspectives is we have what we need within us. And my job is to like help bring that out again with the other people who are pieces of that puzzle. And that was like a really cool experience. I've worked with other athletes who have raced up to the world championship level. And that's been really cool experience, a really cool experience, like meeting them and working through maybe some of the challenges that they're having. And I work with a lot of triathletes too, and a lot of it comes around the swim, which is like the first in a triathlon. I've dealt with that myself. I hate to swim. But as we've talked about extensively in this podcast, like early in the race kind of sets the tone for later in the race. So if we can kind of address those pre-race stressors, especially when they revolve around the swim, and it can be done fairly easily, how to address those, it's going to pay dividends over the course of that race. So that's been a cool experience from my perspective because it's something I dealt with, and now having these tools like to give them to other athletes or work with other athletes to develop those skills and see them pay benefits and dividends is really cool.
Nice. Those are exciting stories. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And thank you, Adam, for not only your service to the country, but for coming on the podcast and talking with us for the past hour about your background, mental performance. This was super enlightening for me. I love talking with experts in their field who are practitioners as well as athletes themselves with personal experience. And you're just a wealth of information, and we're really grateful to have you on. So thank you for coming on with us.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, and yeah, it's really cool to meet you in person and have this discussion with you. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, nice. And I'm glad that I was able to meet you on the track and run some miles with you and then bring you onto the show. So small world,
Yeah,
it all kind of comes together, right?
that's right. From Tunnel Hill to now, so it's really cool.
That's right. Yeah.
That's right.
So thanks again.
Yeah, and maybe I'll see you guys out on the field or out on the
I sure hope so.
trail, I guess, in this instance.
All right. Well, take care, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This has been Coffee with Coaches. Enjoy your weekend.
Bye.
Yeah.